In our first two installments, we worked through how to calculate when two players are involved. Now we're going to kick things up a notch. Welcome to part 3 of the Final Wager. I'm hoping that 3-player games won't be as scary as they were before. We're just going to break it down into 2-player games. First versus second, second versus third, and first versus third. Let's start by looking at an example from part 1. We have Tim in first with 14,200, Liz in second with 11,000, and Jason in third with 7,600. We'll break this down into 2-player games, starting with Tim and Liz, then Liz and Jason, and finally Tim and Jason. We calculated optimal wagers for Tim and Liz in part 1, but we'll do it again here for a refresher. Rule number 1 says that Tim wants to cover an all-in wager by Liz. If Liz wagers everything and gets it right, she'll have 22,000. To match this total, Tim will need to wager at least 7,800, so 7,800 is his minimum wager. We now look at Liz, who should focus on what will happen should Tim answer incorrectly. A wrong response will put Tim at no more than 6,400. To stay at or above this total, Liz can wager no more than 4,600. For rule number 3, at most one player can ever safely wager to be above a 0 wager by the other. When it's close, look at the trailer. If Tim wagers 0, he'll have 14,200. To match this, Liz will need to wager at least 3,200. So that's first versus second. Let's look at second versus third. Liz wants to cover a double up by Jason, who would have 15,200 if that came to pass. To match this, Liz will need to wager at least 4,200. This supersedes her previous minimum of 3,200. After all, if she's wagering at least 4,200, then she's wagering at least 3,200. Now for Jason. An incorrect response from Liz will leave her with 6,800. To stay above this, Jason can wager no more than 800. Finally, for rule number 3. 3,400 separates our 2 players. Jason cannot wager 3,400, as that violates his maximum wager of 800. And Liz already must wager between 4,200 and 4,600, so we ignore rule number 3 for her, too. And now I'll say goodbye to second for the time being and look at first and third. We know that Tim must wager 7,800 to cover Liz. If he gets it wrong, he'll have at most 6,400. Jason can wager no more than 1,200 to stay above this total, but he's already limited to at most 800, so he'll keep his maximum at 800. So here are our results. Tim needs to wager at least 7,800, Liz between 4,200 and 4,600, and Jason no more than 800. So how do you feel about the math? It's not simple, but remember, you get all the time you want, so take all the time you need. Even if you're a math genius, there's a lot of pressure, and one small error of addition or subtraction could cost you a lot. Let's look at one more example, and for this one, I'm going to draw it on the board. We have John in first place with 16,400, Helen in second with 13,800, and Barbara in third with 9,000. We'll start with first and second, John and Helen. John wants to cover an all-in wager by Helen. 27,600. So John will need to wager at least 11,200. If he gets it wrong, he'll have 5,200. So to stay at or above this total, what will Helen need to wager? Against John, Helen can wager at most 8,600. Now we turn to rule number 3. The difference between these two scores is 2,600. John already needs to wager at least 11,200, so that won't work. But Helen can wager up to 8,600, so we can restrict her wager in this way. We've done first and second, now let's turn our attention to second and third. Helen will want to cover an all-in wager by Barbara. So the math shows that she needs to wager at least 4,200. What if she gets it wrong? She'll be left with 9,600. Now notice that Barbara only has 9,000, so she needs to get it right to cover this wager. And you'll see she needs to wager at least 600 to cover that. Now we turn to rule number 3. The difference between these two scores is 4,800. We can restrict Helen's maximum wager to no more than that, so she doesn't fall below Barbara should she get it wrong. Finally, we turn to first and third. John, as we know, is going to wager at least 11,200. So should he respond incorrectly, he'll be left with 5,200. Barbara will want to stay above this total. So that means she can wager no more than 3,800. So there we have it. In this three-player game, John will want to wager 11,200, Helen between 4,200 and 4,800, and Barbara between 600 and 3,800. That's it for part 3. Before moving on, you want to make sure you have this math nailed down. So go to my website and check out daily analysis or wagering scenarios. You'll find plenty to do. We'll see you next time on the Final Wager. That's it for part 3. Before you move on to the next part, that's it for part 3. But before we move on to the next installment, you really want to have this math nailed down. So if you're completely... Boop, boop, boop. That's it for part 3.